And then already in the 80s, towards the end of the Cold War, some scholars started saying, but actually we cannot only focus on military issues. Security is not just about war and weapons of mass destruction. And actually also, especially if you think about like everyday life, a lot of people would not be so worried about weapons of mass destruction. They would have other concerns. And already at that time, actually, some scholars started saying, some issues are actually even more important, issues like the environment, pollution, because actually, if we don't look after the planet, if there's a lot of pollution, if there's climate change and the earth becomes inhabitable, then there's no, we have really failed there. There's no security anymore. There's no question around conflicts and war and weapons of mass destruction because we won't be able to live. Well, the people started saying energy is one of the main issues, access to energy. Some people started talking about health. So already actually in the 1980s, so that's already 40 years ago, scholars were saying we're not in agreement about what security is. So it doesn't mean that everybody is reflecting like that on security. Actually, you will find some books and some scholars who are very precise and who are convinced that security still is about war, is about conflict between states, is about things like weapons of mass destruction and the use of the military. But you will find a lot of other scholars who disagree with that. And some of the work we've done with Christian has been using securitization theory, which is something that appeared in the 1990s and which was developed by a Danish scholar who said, and a lot of people have actually criticized that, saying that it's quite actually a Eurocentric view of security, but he started saying, well, actually people in Europe, but he said it more broadly, but actually what actually he really meant, I guess he was mainly influenced in his thinking by the European experience. He said people don't really worry about war, but what they worry about is actually their culture, their identity, and he coined this concept of securitization. So he said there are no issues that are security issues in themselves, so I cannot say objectively this is a security issue, that one is not a security issue. He said issues become security issues when the people in power, the people who have the ability to do so, say this issue is a security issue. So, for example, if you think of the United States after the terrorist attacks on 9/11, saying Bin Laden, Al-Qaeda is a security issue. The Taliban are a security issue because they are harboring Al-Qaeda. So it's about, and usually, it's not just me or you who would be able to transform an issue as a security issue. You need to usually to be in a position of power, has a certain form of authority and of legitimacy to say this issue is a security issue, and we need to take special measures, extraordinary measures to address it. And perhaps, Christian, you want to say a bit more about that?
Yes, I think I got the idea, and this has created a new question for me. That I would like to ask this question to Christian. And the question, Christian, is a very simple question for our students, right? I understood now this idea of security, that it's like not an objective thing, but it's like a human construction. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. So my question for you, it's a difficult question, but I believe that the students will understand. My question is, Christian, if a tree falls in a forest and there is nobody there to hear it, does it make a sound? Does it make a noise?
Well, I wouldn't be there to verify.
This is a very difficult philosophical question, Christian, right? So if a tree falls in a forest, but there's nobody around to hear it, does it make a sound?
Yes,
Well, what's your initial answer to this question? Not as a philosopher, but as an ordinary person. Do you think it makes a sound or it doesn't make a sound?
I think I'll be the diplomat and I say it depends what it falls onto.
What do you think, Sarah? You are the philosopher. So what do you think about this question?
I'm not a philosopher by training. I'm not even a
But
philosopher.
I read your publications. I consider you a great philosopher, Sarah. I read what you wrote about security, and I can assure all our students that you are a great philosopher. So don't be shy. You tell us, if the tree falls in a forest and there's no one around to hear it, does it make a sound?
Yes, it does, and you don't need to have somebody around. You could have, a recording device that would record the sound. So I guess that you were led to this question because when it comes to security, it's actually one of the criticisms that was leveled at the Copenhagen School, notably by another researcher from Denmark. And she wrote a really interesting article already many years ago about using this analogy of the Little Mermaid. And what she meant by that was that the issue that she has, so her name is Lene Hansen, if you are interested in looking at her writings. So she was saying that the issue and the limitation she sees with the Copenhagen School is that if we say it's the governments who socially construct, mainly the governments, because you have to be in a position of power and of legitimacy to socially construct an issue. So if it's roughly the governments socially constructing issues, does that mean that the issues that are not on the radar of governments are not security issues? And so she's kind of saying, it's like the Little Mermaid when she's unable to speak. And so she's giving the example of those so-called honor crimes. So, women who may end up being, injured or killed even by family members, if it's considered that perhaps they're having an inappropriate behavior at some point in their life, perhaps not choosing the right partner in the view of the family. And she was saying it's an issue that hasn't really been constructed as an issue, that is not really on the agenda as being a security issue. And these women are in a position of vulnerability and that they are not able to speak up. They don't have a voice. And we can think of other issues like that. If you think, for example, of the terrible conditions in which some asylum seekers and migrants end up in as they are, on their way to Europe or in other parts of the world. These issues don't always make it into the media. These people don't have the power to speak up and to talk about, the fact that their life is really threatened. So there can't be anything that is more security than the situation. But it's not spoken about by the government. So does it mean that it's not a security issue?
This confirms what I said before, that you understood perfectly the objective of my question was related to this idea of the definition of security, because when I read your writings about the issue, I realized that most of the debate is debate about what security is, right? And the case with this philosophical problem, that's a basic one. On the Wikipedia, you can find it. If a tree falls in a forest and there's no one around to hear it, does it make a sound? In the end, it's also a problem about the definition of sound, how you define sound. If you define sound as the vibrations that the tree falling creates on your ear, and there's no ear around to hear it, then there's no sound. But if you define the sound as something else, so you think you very well mentioned, if there's a recording device or if there's some way of measuring this sound, then there would be a sound. But the physicists who debated this initially, they couldn't come to an agreement, and the most accepted answer was that there was no sound, as sound was defined. But the debate is ongoing because it depends on the definition. In the case of security, I believe it's the same thing with this securitization theory, isn't it? How you define security? Is it something like you say, out of sight, out of mind, and therefore, because security is a creation of the mind, then if it's you don't see it, you are not conscious about it, then it's not a security problem, right? What you mentioned now about migrants in their conditions, was that what you meant?
I wouldn't say that it's entirely a construction of the mind in the sense that I don't think it is something entirely subjective. Rather, it's something intersubjective. So it's not just like when you are going to present something as a security issue, and even somebody in a position of power, they will have to point at some material elements to make the argument convincing. And it's only if others accept that indeed there is a security issue that it will, really become one, if you like. And that intersubjective element, I think, is really important, because I think there is a material element, because sometimes people misunderstand securitization and just say, oh, do you mean that it's like it's all in our heads, or that anything can be socially constructed as an issue? But as a security issue, but not exactly, actually, because you need some kind of material element to persuade people that something is a security issue. And we saw that, for example, with George W. Bush, when he wanted to convince people that Saddam Hussein was a threat. There was, and same in the UK with Tony Blair, trying to convince Parliament to go to war. In Iraq, there was this whole, file and this, kind of evidence. I mean, we know in the end that there were some issues with the evidence, but you can see that there was this idea that, in order to convince people, you need to provide some evidence. Although then, it's not perfect, and people, will, and you get into very complicated issues around trust, around whether people may be gullible or maybe swayed in some ways, maybe lied to, and then you start touching onto issues around propaganda and fake news. But I would say that it's not entirely in our head, it's not entirely subjective, it is intersubjective. So you will need, it can't be constructed out of nowhere, a security issue. But it's true that there can be instrumentalization and manipulation to convince people that something is a security issue.
I see. Good. And Christian, my question for you now, it's about your current research in security in Europe. I read your CV and I saw that you have specialized yourself in counterterrorism. I think that you became interested in this topic in 2011, right?
No, 2001.
2001. Wow. Yes, in 2000. Yes, in 9/11 in 2001, right?
That's it. Yeah, 2000 exactly. 9/11. That's what prompted me to start researching in that area. That was the, if you will, the inception of all that research. I think for a lot of people, but in fact it was, yes, also for me.
Mm-hmm. And I heard Sarah mentioning that the idea of security was initially thought about in terms of war between countries or between leaders of sovereign nations, right? But I think that your approach to security is more like a domestic approach, right? More like internal security, like the kind of security the FBI would take care of in the US, right?
I guess you could argue that, although of course the DGBGO had also made the argument that, you know, security cannot be confined to internal or external, that the boundaries are very much blurred. And in fact, you see that in real life also, that, you know, the FBI and CIA or MI5 and MI6, they're often also working together, right?
Yes, sometimes they even have turf wars, right? They have conflicts of jurisdiction about issues. That's very interesting. So what do you think are the current challenges, the current security challenges in Europe, and why our students from so many different countries and backgrounds, why they should care about these issues?
Right. I mean, there's quite a long list of security issues that are really important. I mean, in order of priority, obviously, if we look at the Eurobarometer or look at what normal, ordinary citizens, like you say in the title of the talk, what they tend to think. In fact, one of the big issues is, of course, terrorism, as you pointed out. It is something that perhaps has lost a little bit in salience over the last 2 or 3 years, but it's still fairly high up the ranking of most people. Of course, as of more recently, with the pandemic, we've had a massive jump of health security, right? Because obviously health security is always there at the background, because the pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, isn't the first pandemic that there ever has been. There have been many before, but it is a truly global one that obviously since the so-called Spanish flu we haven't really had. And as a result of that, it has really catapulted health security to the top of the agenda. But of course, for ordinary citizens, there's others as well. Then there's, of course, increasingly the perception in Europe in particular that migration is seen as a security issue. It is something that people increasingly mention.
Yes, please let me ask you about this issue, migration, because I see it now, it's very related to the two major issues you just mentioned. You mentioned terrorism and you mentioned also health. And I see now that sometimes terrorism is being linked to migration, like many commentators are using this argument that migration, uncontrolled migration poses a threat of terrorism. But I see now also in the case of South Africa, this problem with the health also, that migrations of people or just tourist visits of people, movements of people across borders can also be seen as a threat to health security. And I would like you to comment on that link between the movement of people and security issues, because many of our students are studying a master's in tourism and they are very interested about the movements of people, right?
So of course, tourists are a particular security issue, as you can imagine. But no, I mean, what you pointed out is an argument that has been made, of course. And on a number of occasions, for instance, at some point I was on Sputnik News and they were trying to get me to say, are those refugees possibly terrorists? And I think, obviously, I didn't give them the straight answer that they wanted. But
this usually happens with journalists, right? They want you to confirm what they have as the answer to the question that they like.
Yes, especially if they get the editorial line from Moscow. But they certainly wanted to push me to say the migrants are potential terrorists. And I mean, if we look at the 2015 crisis, if we look at it relatively rationally and calmly, just looking at the evidence, we can see that some people who crossed the border during those flows of people were later then involved in some terror attacks. Now, I choose the word some very carefully, because if you look at the amount of people that really crossed the border at that moment, and then you look at the amount of people that were involved in some terror attacks, there's a very, very small link. You know, there were a number of people indeed, but of course, compared to the amount of people that actually crossed the border, it's a very, 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 very small percentage. But materially, just like Sarah was pointing out earlier, there needs to be something that people point to materially. And for instance, if we look at the Paris terror attacks, or we look at the Berlin terror attacks, there was a certain material dimension. Not necessarily to refugees, and that's another important aspect, because of course refugees are a very particularly defined category of migrants. They are defined by having been persecuted and having actually crossed the state boundary. So that is a very, very important aspect to it. So if we take that definition, actually the percentage of people that were actually involved in a terror attack is even smaller than if we just take the broader definition of migration or of just crossing boundaries. But there was a material dimension there, so we cannot say it didn't happen. But in the larger scale things, it wasn't a very very significant amount of people. It was a very, very small percentage, in fact.
Yes,
Now, if we look at health security, it's of course more complicated, because it depends on which particular health dimension are we talking about. Here, we were talking, like with South Africa, we were talking about COVID-19, we were talking about a pandemic, we were talking about a virus that is transmissible from person to person. So obviously, with a virus that is transmissible from person to person, we have the mobility aspect that gains much more of a security dimension, because of course it is precisely this mixing of people.
I just read today on DW, Deutsche Welle, about this South African problem, and they were asking the question whether you are blaming the messenger because they discovered this new variant, and you are punishing them for disclosing this. But what I did not understand in the headline of this piece of news is that they said that they asked if this was racist. And I don't know what race has to do with this. I would say it's more nationalist than racist, right?
Well, I mean, I think the argument they were trying to make is this racist is, of course, this happens to an African country, and therefore is it that they're doing that because, you know, it is an African country, rather than, let's say, if that had been a Western country like Spain or Germany or whatever, would they have done the same thing? It's a hypothetical question because we don't have a concrete example where this has happened, but it is a fair question to the extent where we can say, well, yes, of course, it feels like punishing to South Africa, right? Because the scientists have discovered the virus and then they're imposing restrictions. But at the same time, you also have to see the background. If you look at the British experience, for instance, the British experience comes from the point of view that just about a year ago, we had another variant that was spreading, right? And initially it was called the so-called Indian variant. Later it was then said, no, you shouldn't be calling it like that. It's now the Delta variant. Some people remember both. But I think the important point to remember is it was at the time also then not discovered in the West. It was discovered at the time in India. And the British government was very criticized for having done far too little, far too late. Yeah? At the time, the criticism was made, the British government is in fact allowing the spread of this Delta variant to come in because it wants to do a trade deal with India. The trade deal never materialized, but the Delta virus actually did spread very significantly in the United Kingdom and then later in Europe and everywhere else also. So I think it's with that background that you have to understand the situation as it happened in the UK this year. or quite concretely now in South Africa, that of course we have a government that had been criticized very, very severely for having been very slow at the time with the Delta variant. So obviously, listening to the virologists, they took a decision, no, we cannot do the same thing again. We don't know enough about the virus, and therefore we have to, in a sense, impose restrictions in a way that they didn't when it came
Good.
to India.
I think you mentioned now talking about migrants, terrorism, health, and you just confirmed there's some material basis, some objective basis. But Sarah, I would like to ask her about this securitization theory. It says there needs to be some material basis, but it's not enough. You need the involvement of some powerful leaders to make the issue a security issue. Could you please tell us more about this in this context?
I think if you take the case of that link between migration and terrorism, it's something that was kind of mentioned a little bit after 9/11, but that didn't get so much traction. A bit more perhaps in the United States than in Europe, because obviously the terrorist attacks had taken place there. And a lot of the people who had committed the attacks had entered the country quite easily, and so they kind of looked a little bit into their visa policies and into the checks they were making on people. And some people in Europe made some negative comments as well about migrants and asylum seekers and terrorists, but that didn't get so much traction. But like Christian said, the turning point, I think, in Europe was actually the fact that in 2015, 2016, we had around the same time the so-called refugee crisis, so more than 1 million people arriving in Europe from Syria and the region mainly. And then around the same time, there were several terrorist attacks. And to some extent, both were related in the sense that notably what was a big factor behind people crossing and seeking refuge in Europe was obviously the activities of the Islamic State. And the Islamic State was also behind some of the terrorist attacks. And in particular, what had a big impact on Europe and on the European Union was this Franco-Belgian cell that conducted the terrorist attacks in Paris in November 15 and then in Brussels in March 16. And then it turned out that some of the people involved in that cell had indeed managed to enter Europe because they were known to the security services of several European countries, and they had managed to come back from the Middle East, entering through Greece, and kind of taking advantage of the fact that so many people were arriving around that time that the authorities were not able to check on people thoroughly. And then there were also several people who managed to enter Europe using fake ID documents. And so the numbers, obviously, the number of terrorists are quite small, and so the number of people who are migrants and terrorists or asylum seekers and terrorists is even smaller. But we know the impact that terrorism has on public opinion. And you don't need so many terrorist attacks or so many people. I mean, and I think it's important also to say that these were not like, genuine, if you like, asylum seekers who somehow became radicalized. No, they were people posing as asylum seekers. They were not in danger in any shape or form, but they decided to take advantage of this refugee crisis to kind of hide themselves, if you like, hide amongst other people looking for refuge. And we're talking about a very small number of people, but did it have an impact on Europe and on the European Union, notably because some people, usually on quite on the right in political debates, talked quite a lot about that. So that's those people are from far right parties like Marine Le Pen in France from the Rassemblement National, or people like Viktor Orban made several derogatory comments, really linking asylum seekers and terrorism, and saying how we need to protect Europe from terrorism. Therefore, we need to close our borders and close our societies to asylum seekers. So those are the people, had a really big impact. They were able to seize upon some cases, and as Krishna mentioned as well, there were some terrorist attacks in Germany on quite a small scale, but they did involve people who had arrived in Germany and applied for asylum. And so there were some cases like that could be used by some people, or usually on the right or from populist parties, to make this linkage between asylum seekers and terrorism. And unfortunately, it looks like that link has become quite cemented in Europe, and we saw that in August, as the Taliban were taking Afghanistan over. There were immediately these reactions in Europe saying, oh, we don't want a repeat of 2015-16, we don't want a lot of asylum seekers coming because we have to protect people in Europe. So there was immediately this kind of link that, asylum seekers are potential terrorists. And I think that that's really worrying in terms of our obligation towards asylum seekers. And it is based on a very small number of cases, but some political leaders have made a big case. And obviously, we also know that they are helped in the task by the political agenda of some media outlets as well. So, for example, the tabloid press in Britain is also heavily involved in spreading stories about asylum seekers being dangerous. And there are such newspapers in tabloids in other European countries. So it's the role of the media and of some political leaders, usually on the right, that have had a big impact in making this link between migration or asylum seekers and terrorism.
Yes, talking about the media in the UK, what's this new TV channel, or I see on YouTube very often, GB News? What's it about?
Is that for me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, the way they've been presented, and I guess they've contributed to the presentation themselves a little bit, is a kind of British version of Fox News. If you know what Fox News is, it's to the right of the BBC, to the right of all the other private British channels, if you like. And initially, I guess there had been a debate as to how far right. Certainly there were some commentators there, like Andrew Mead, who initially was seen as more still on the conservative end of presentation, but increasingly then he accused GB News of being a so-called UKIP tribute band. UKIP tribute band because, of course, they hired a very famous politician, Nigel Farage, who was also very instrumental in terms of Brexit, as one of the main presenters. And in fact, just 1 or 2 days ago, he had a massive interview with former US President Donald Trump on GB News. So this is also then, in a sense, confirming to an extent the political line that they take. So it's meant to be a sort of a British version of Fox News, if you like.
Okay. One question for Sarah. It's about this police cooperation between the UK and France related to migration, that it's also a very current topic. And it seems that there is some cooperation, but on the other hand, there's also some public conflicts. But there were some recent comments by Macron, like saying that when the leaders talk to each other, there's cooperation. It's only then in the public declarations towards public opinion that they create these artificial conflicts. What's the real situation? Is there cooperation between the UK and France for migration control?
Well, I'm not sure. I'm not, part of the meetings between Macron and Johnson, but I think what is important to remember is that the background to the current dispute is that they both seek to speak to their own domestic audience, and obviously President Macron is facing a presidential election next year, whereas Boris Johnson is, he has a lot of work in the UK. There are quite a few things that he has to look after, and so I think that they always speak to their own domestic audience, and sometimes I guess that for both of them, migration is quite a sensitive issue, so they are both trying to appear quite tough on that issue. Because for the French, this issue around a lot of migrants gathering in this area, trying to cross the channel, it's an issue that has been going on for many years, and that actually has been very, very sensitive for French governments. And what French governments have done, and what the way in which the authorities are dealing with the migrants in that region, that's always been very controversial. So you will have some people saying that the French authorities are not doing enough, that it's really a humanitarian disaster, that people are, sleeping rough, that they don't have food, that they are really miserable, and so that the French state isn't doing, the minimum that is required to look after these people properly. But then on the right, you will have people saying that actually this is terrible to see all those migrants, and then there will be stories around violence, people being afraid of going out at night, and crime going up in the region, and feeling that the government is actually too sympathetic towards these people, and that we need to take much tougher measures. So it's a really difficult situation. And things have changed over time. So if the authorities say we're going to build proper reception facilities to house people, then they are criticized because allegedly that would bring more people to the area. If they let people sleep rough in the street, obviously that that is very bad as well. So I think it's a really difficult situation for the French authorities, and I think that's something that is not quite recognized in the UK, where they just say, well, why aren't the French finally doing something? I think that the French have been trying to do something for a very long time. So there is this agreement between the UK and France that goes back to a few years. So it's the so-called Le Touquet agreement, which a lot of people in France have criticized because it gives the right to actually the British border authorities to do some controls in France. And so you may have seen that if you've traveled in Europe, if you took the Eurostar train in Brussels or in Paris, you may have seen that actually you already have British border controls there. And likewise, when you take the train in London, you are already controlled by the French gendarmerie in London in the Eurostar terminal. And also that has opened the door to actually some practical cooperation between the border forces and the police forces on both sides, and also with Belgium, because there are also quite a lot of migrants trying to reach the UK departing from Belgium. So I think that there is cooperation on the ground, and if you speak to people in the border forces, they say that they are not always affected by all these political disagreements, but that everyday cooperation works quite well. But of course, Brexit has brought some challenges there, and notably the fact that now cooperation between police forces, and because there is all these emphasis on how people are being smuggled into the UK, that actually you have like criminal gangs getting a lot of money to transport people to the UK. Obviously, that's something for the police to deal with. And now that the UK has left the EU, that has made police cooperation, the sharing of information, more complicated. So the stance of countries like France and Belgium is to say, well, you're calling for collaboration and cooperation, but you're the country that has just left the EU. So to kind of, say, well, we need to find a common solution. It's a common problem. We need to work together. Well, you were in the club that was working together before, and you've made a decision to leave. And so I think that's why it's all difficult at the moment, that obviously that issue has been a very sensitive issue for many years. And now it's kind of intersecting with all the sensitivities around Brexit and the fact that Brexit has been taken as a form of criticism, obviously, by the countries that are still in the EU. And I think that really complicates cooperation. There is still a certain degree of cooperation. I think that, it's still going on despite the political rhetoric. But I think if you think about it, it's you don't really see a solution to that issue very easily, because people will continue to want to go to the UK because of the English language, because of the position of the UK in the world and the ties between the region of origin and the UK, because now there may be like a whole community that can help them. So the fact that the UK attracts a lot of people, and the fact that the conditions in the world are such that a lot of people are on the move looking for asylum, or at least for bettering their life, it's going to continue in future. So I actually don't really see a solution to that issue in the next few years, to be honest.
I have got a related question for Christian about this. It regards Belarus, because I think there's also a similar situation, or not the same, of course, but in some sense, the EU also had an agreement with Belarus to help with migrant control and with hosting migrants in Belarus. And when the EU started criticizing the results of Belarus elections and reacted with sanctions towards Belarus, it seems that this agreement was broken, right? And now the EU is accusing Belarus of weaponizing migrants, right? Turning migration into a weapon with security implications. What can you tell us about this, Christian?
Yeah, I think with regards to Belarus, it's kind of important to point out roughly what the main migration routes into Europe are. I mean, historically speaking, there's like three main migration routes into Europe. There's been one that goes from Morocco into Spain. So that is the kind of Western migration route. Then you have the central one that tends to go from Libya into Italy. And then as of more recently, the one that's been most prominent is in fact the one from Turkey into Greece. Those were the three main migration routes into Europe. At varied stages over the last 20 years, we've seen one of the migration routes becoming bigger, the other one becoming smaller, depending on what agreements they had. The Italians had agreements with Gaddafi, and the Spanish have agreements with Morocco. And of course, the EU has also now an agreement also with Erdogan. And I think we have seen a similar-ish, and I say similar-ish because it's not identical, scenario, of course, with Turkey. Yeah? In Turkey, we had a situation, thanks to the war in Syria, Turkey attracted a very, very large number of migrants from Syria, partially and because President Erdogan welcomed them. He said at the beginning of the war that the Muslim brothers are welcomed in Turkey. He perhaps didn't quite calculate how many would come. In the end, there were 5 or 6 million that came, also thanks to the Russian friends in Syria that were pushing them into Turkey quite significantly. They were pushing the routes very heavily into Turkey. And he then used them partially to gain, if you will, political benefits and also financial and monetary benefits from the European Union when he then pushed a number of those migrants into Greece. Now, the situation with Belarus is significantly different. Firstly, Belarus, while it superficially did something similar to Turkey, it also did something very different. Belarus is not a migration route into Europe. Belarus has never been a migration route into Europe. And it is unlikely to ever become a migration route into Europe, simply because the migration routes don't go through the Caucasus into Russia and from Russia into Belarus. that migration route just doesn't exist. Now, how do those migrants arrive in Belarus? The way they arrived in Belarus was because President Lukashenko, basically the first thing is he invented a new visa status for people from Syria, for people from Iraq, and he basically allowed them to come into Belarus as tourists. Yeah? He allowed them to travel into Belarus as tourists and provided them with a very, very easy way in that didn't exist before. This was an immediate creation that he created after, as you rightly pointed out, the sanction regime entered into force with Belarus. The second important thing that he did was he created new avenues for travel. So he instructed Belavia and other airlines to actually fly into certain areas like Damascus, like Baghdad, and also like Istanbul, in order to bring those people into Belarus. So he specifically brought thousands and thousands of people who otherwise would have never arrived in Belarus, who couldn't arrive in Belarus, who historically have never gone to Belarus. He invited them in and then pushed them with his security forces into Polish territory. So there were even reports in some of the media where security services of Belarus reported that in fact both Belarusian security services, intelligence services, and Russian security services trained some specific people of those streams, some guerrilla fighters, if you will, in specifically creating conditions of violence at the border. They trained them in terms of how to militarily take over the border and to create a violent situation there at the border. So they did far more than just not fulfilling their deal with the European Union. They in fact created this situation out of thin air, a situation that did not exist in Belarus, and they trained them militarily in order to inflame that situation and to create it into a violent situation that potentially then could be used as a situation in a potential military conflict. It might still be used in a situation of military conflict with surrounding countries, for instance, Ukraine.
So the final purpose probably is not to help those migrants get into Europe, because even the time of the year with such cold weather, it's very bad for that. So what do you think is the real purpose of this operation, Christian?
It's very difficult to say. I mean, the likelihood is that this operation is not conceived in Minsk. The likelihood is that this operation is conceived in Moscow, and that in fact the main people designing that operation are sitting in the Kremlin and are not sitting in Minsk. That Minsk is probably doing what Moscow wants them to be doing. And there is, of course, reports, as you have probably heard as well, whether they're true or not, I cannot verify, but there are reports that, of course, we have significant amount of Russian troops around the Ukrainian borders. There's those fears that potentially Russia could militarily intervene in Ukraine. But it's entirely possible that the situation in Belarus is a diversion tactic from the military strategy.
Related to this, Christian, there's now a new foreign minister in Germany, and she has made some declarations today or yesterday, I don't know, saying that she wants to change the foreign policy of Germany to be less contractual, less consent less the violation of international norms for economic gains. But on the other hand, the comments that Lukashenko made in the BBC interview recently it gave the impression that he may want just to be recognized and be left in peace by the EU, or he may just want the sanctions to be finished, and that's so that he can continue in power, or even continue with the benefits he had, the economic benefits from the previous agreement for hosting migrants in Belarus. Do you think that this conflict can be solved economically? Like, for instance, the conflicts between Spain and Morocco. Morocco also seemed to have weaponized migrants at some point, right? Pushing them to cross the border with Spain. But in the end, it was about the desire to remain in power and to keep the economic benefits that they are used to. It's like a renegotiation of a deal. You think this could be the case in Belarus, or do you think it's something worse, as you suggest, like an excuse for a Russian military operation?
Yes. No, I don't want to give the impression that it's definitely an excuse for a Russian military operation, but I think there is a significant difference. I think when we talk about Morocco, when we talk about Libya at the time and so on, or even if we talk about Turkey, we're talking directly between the parties that had those interests and that were also then in control of the situation. When you're looking at Belarus, you're not talking about a party that is entirely in control of the situation. President Lukashenko lost control of the situation when he lost the elections, the presidential elections, and he faked the results. And ever since then, he has in fact become at the mercy of President Putin in Russia, which then means that whatever happens in Belarus is no longer his own choosing. So as you rightly point out, that perhaps for President Lukashenko, it really is about being recognized, it really is about remaining in power for him personally. But he's no longer in control of that situation in Belarus. He's not the one calling the shots there. He's not the one that directs the military operations in Belarus. He is not in charge. So he has to be very careful that if he doesn't follow the Kremlin line, Belarus is potentially, and I say this carefully, but is potentially not an independent country for so much longer anymore, because his regime is totally dependent on Russia. His regime is totally dependent on President Putin, and whatever he does, he has to calculate the possibility of an enforced union state that exists already in paper. You probably know that there is a union state that exists on paper between Belarus and Russia, but that the Russians so far have not forced upon him in terms of actual reality, of substance. But because of his very, very strong dependence on the Kremlin, any mistakes that he might make could lead to, in a sense, to the elimination of Belarus as an independent state.
Yes, Christian, talking now about the German position or the EU position, which is the same thing in this issue, I think. Do you think that this will end up like in the case of Ukraine, when before the revolution in Ukraine, the EU at the moment was negotiating with the leader of the country to remain in power, and but in the end, I think it might have been the United States or some other power that forced the revolution to happen at that time. Do you think that the German government will want to negotiate with Lukashenko to keep the status quo? And if so, do you think they will succeed, or they will a revolution will be forced in some way by some other power?
I think the German government, as you perhaps saw, outgoing Chancellor Angela Merkel was in fact negotiating partly with Lukashenko. I think any German government has a certain historical connection to Russia, which is also linked to the Second World War, which is also linked to the German reunification and so on. So any future German government is not going to be perhaps as confrontational as, let's say, a British government or an American government might be. What is true, though, is that the new foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, she is certainly somebody who has made more critical noises of both Russian President Putin and of also Belarusian President Lukashenko. And she's perhaps slightly less likely to be as entertaining of some of the developments as towards the end, certainly, outgoing Chancellor Angela Merkel was.
Merkel was said to be more pragmatic, more in economic terms, getting results, good value for money in the negotiations. Do you think that this will change with the new foreign minister?
I think if the foreign minister is really defining German foreign policy, we might see a slight change. But what we should not forget is that the party that holds the chancellery is in fact the Social Democrats, and that the new chancellor will be Olaf Scholz, who was in fact general secretary under nobody else than Gerhard Schröder. He was somebody who has worked very closely with Gerhard Schröder for many years, and as such, he will be the one ultimately defining German foreign policy. And because of that, I would say that we will see probably a slight shift, maybe a slight stiffening of the German position, but I don't see we will see radical changes because it's still the Social Democrats that are calling the shots in the government.
Yes, I've got a final question for Sarah, I think, but if not for you, but for Sarah in principle, because this cooperation between the UK and France, and at some point the UK government was calling for France to reaccept some of the migrants that cross the channel, and this brings me two questions. This idea of pushbacks in general, but also in the European context between a former EU country and now, it's about this Dublin Convention. If this Dublin Convention is still in force for the UK, or it was something part of the EU that after leaving the EU it no longer applies?
Yeah, so just for the student, perhaps to clarify, the Dublin system is based on an old convention signed in Dublin many years ago in the 1990s. And the purpose of the convention was to establish criteria establishing which EU member state is responsible for examining an application from an asylum seeker. So there were two issues that the convention was trying to tackle. So the first was the problem of the so-called refugees in orbit. So people who perhaps had arrived in one country, let's say in Italy, then applied for asylum, then perhaps later they moved to Germany, where perhaps they applied for asylum as well. And in the end, nobody was dealing with them because Germany was saying, oh, you should go back to Italy. Italy said, but you were in Germany, go back there. And in the end, some people were kind of trapped and nobody was actually processing the application for asylum. So they were not getting the protection they needed. And then the other problem was, if you like, the kind of corollary that was the so-called asylum shopping. And that's something that a lot of governments were concerned about. where they felt that perhaps some people arrive in Europe, they apply for asylum in one place, then they go to another country, maybe they apply again, and in the end, several countries are processing the same asylum application. So they tried to come up with a list of criteria to define which country is actually responsible. And also, and the system has evolved over the years and actually really became part of the European Union and of the European Union rules. And also, you can do the so-called Dublin return. So if asylum seekers fulfill certain criteria, then you can send them back to the country through which they entered the European Union first. So there are a lot of criteria and it's very complicated. And one of them is actually family reunification. That's normally, if you have family in a member state of the EU, then according to certain rules, that's where your application will be processed. But in quite a lot of cases, it's the country through which you enter the European Union which is responsible for dealing with your application. And of course, it's a very asymmetric and unfair system because, as you can imagine, there are far more people entering the EU and claiming asylum through Greece or Italy than through Finland or actually even the UK. And so that's a general problem, and actually I think that's a problem we see everywhere in the world, that there's a certain tendency for states to try and pass the buck and saying, oh, why don't you go back there, where they could deal with your application. So the UK's position is that people shouldn't cross the whole of Europe to find protection, that they should just enter Europe and stay there, perhaps in France, perhaps elsewhere. But if you like, the line that the government takes is that, in a sense, there is no good reason for pretty much any asylum seeker in the view to come to the UK, because they don't arrive, obviously, directly in the UK, but they tend to enter Europe through another state, and therefore.
But how does Brexit affect this deal, the Dublin Convention? It's a sincere question for me. I don't know if this convention is something that with Brexit no longer applies, or if it still applies.
It no longer applies because it initially was actually technically legally outside the framework of the European Union, but then it became part of the EU rules. So when the UK left the EU, it left that as well, and that's something that. And I think we had these discussions very often with Christian. I think that's something that really wasn't part of the run-up to Brexit, and that wasn't part of the political debates when people were discussing what would be the consequences of Brexit. People in favor of Brexit were saying Brexit will allow us to take control of our borders. We'll have control entirely in our hands. And it wasn't really mentioned that actually one of the things that we're going to lose with Brexit was these arrangements that were enabling the UK authorities to return asylum seekers to other countries in Europe. In all fairness, it's not as if they were returning, hundreds of thousands of asylum seekers every year, but it was still used. And obviously at the moment, it's not there anymore. All that is gone, and there are no alternative arrangements that are in place. Mm-hmm. So that's why you see that then there will be asylum seekers coming to the UK, and the British government has been saying, oh well, we're going to bring them back to France. France should take them back, but the truth is that all the Dublin system is gone. It no longer applies to the UK.
Mm-hmm. My question for Christian now related to this. The UK government, I don't know if I read something about this, that they have negotiated with the Albania to have refugee processing camps there and paying £100,000 for each migrant accepted there. It's like outsourcing this, like what Germany did with Turkey.
Yeah, that's what's called wishful thinking. The British government has done no such thing. there's been some briefing of some journalists who have reported on something that the Albanians very categorically have said has never happened and will never happen. And that has been done in the past. I mean, this is an ongoing. Albania has been mentioned for the last 20 years as a possible deal that the British government has made, and it has never, ever actually had a deal with Albania. Even Tony Blair was claiming at the time that he had some deal with Albania. So this is a very long time ago.
So that's fake news, essentially.
This is misbriefing of journalists in order to detract attention.
I see. Good. You know, we have discussed so many topics, but there are so many students, and I would like to, for these students to have the opportunity to talk to you, especially because we, in our course, we have so many students from French-speaking countries that sometimes have difficulties in participating in debates because they don't feel comfortable with the language. But in this case, because you are both French-speaking, probably you would be willing to answer any questions that they make in French language as well, right?
Yes.
Good.
Oui.